Today, we will hear a review of Tommy Orange's searing debut novel, There There, a book that author Omar El-Akid says is a miraculous achievement, a book that wields ferocious honesty and originality in service of telling a story that needs to be told. And here's an excerpt. We've expected the shooter to appear in our lives in the same way we know death is and always has been coming for us, with its decisive seethe, its permanent cut. We've known the shooter could show up anywhere people gathered. We've expected to see him in a periphery, a masked shadow moving through the crowd, picking people off at random, semi-automatic booms, putting bodies down, sending them flailing through the broken air. The bullets have been coming from miles, years. Their sound will break the water in our bodies, tear sound itself, rip our lives in half. The tragedy of it all will be unspeakable. The fact we've been fighting for decades to be recognized as a present tense people, modern and relevant, alive, only to die in the grass wearing feathers. And today we'd like to add, or die in the synagogue wearing yarmulkes, or die in the mosque wearing a headscarf or hijab, or die in church wearing your Sunday best, or die in the mall wearing jeans, or die in school wearing your team's uniform, or die at a parade wearing a rainbow of pride. Our reviewer today is Michael Galban, the curator and interpretive programs assistant for the Seneca Art and Culture Center at Ganondigan State Historic Site in Victor. Ganondigan is a 17th century Seneca town site and nationally regarded as a center for Iroquois history and cultural preservation. Michael is an expert in Native American material culture, specializing in Eastern woodland cultures, and he's been actively working with Haudenosaunee communities to preserve many of the ancient arts for over 20 years. He has worked as a costume and cultural consultant in film and television and on historic site development for many years, and he is also an accomplished craftsman, singer, and dancer. Most recently, as the site historian, he has curated the gallery exhibits at the Seneca Art and Culture Center, which opened in October 2015. Please join me in welcoming Michael Galban.
Okay. So I realize I'm going to be recorded, so there goes about 25% of what I was going to say. No, I'm just kidding. I would just like to extend my gratitude for the invitation to come and speak today and to do something that probably I haven't done in over 30 years, which is, in a way, give a book report. And I suppose what I want to say about the book is that I think it's an important book. And I'll give you reasons why later. I also want to say that I think I enjoyed the book, but not in the way that, somebody enjoys a good meal, But it's important, I think, that maybe you hear from me a little bit about what this book means and maybe about Native people in general, because we're so underrepresented. And when I read the book, and I read it recently, it's very hard to digest because of recent events. But I think it's important, and I think people should pay attention to what we have to say as Native people. And essentially, if you haven't read the book, there's a lot of development of these Native people in an urban setting. American Indian people who find themselves in cities for whatever reason, and their story. We learn an awful lot about what it means to be a Native person in an urban setting. And so what I wanted to do, actually, was to give you my background in an honest way so that you can understand my reaction to what is a pretty powerful book and story, you know. So myself, I come from a diverse background, a multicultural background. My mother was born and raised here in Rochester, New York. She's Italian and Sicilian. My father is from Nevada and California. He's Washoe and Northern Paiute. We descend from people who lived in the Yosemite Valley and the Mono Lake area of California, a little place known as Lee Vining, and around Lake Tahoe and what is now Reno, Carson City, all of that eastern Sierra Nevada mountains. That's really where my father was, our ancestors come from. And we have an interesting family story, I would say, as it relates to Native people. When you meet Native folks, we all have an interesting story, you know. I think all people do, but for Native people, it's a story that not many people get to hear. We don't get the chance to tell those stories. So I'm going to tell you one, and then we'll get to the book a little bit more in depth. So my most famous ancestor is a man that they called Captain John, and he was born sometime in the very early 1800s. One of his names was Pocotaka, means he eats horses, a horse eater. And he was a leader of his community when the Paiute people were in Yosemite Valley. There was a conflict that arose, and they were being led by this one man, and he was a little bit of a he wasn't a great person. He was a cheater in a way. And so the people came to him and they wanted it rectified. This is long, long ago, long before John Muir and the Yosemite was even thought in the non-native world. So my ancestor waited alongside a trail with a large stone, and when this chief walked by, he caved his head in and wrested power away from this bad leader. It was a coup that took place. And so my ancestor, Captain John, then assumed leadership of this band of Paiute people. And he did so for a long time, and he lived in a time of transition when the white settlers were coming in to the west. They were drawn by the gold that they discovered at the famous Sutter's Mill, and they came in droves into California, then later the silver rush into Nevada. And he lived at a time when our way of life, which was, cyclic, we moved, we had seasonal homes like snowbirds. We moved from the valleys to the mountains in the summer. And he experienced the end of that, when people came to him and tapped him on the shoulder and said, "You can't hunt here anymore. This is not your land anymore." He said, "Well, how am I supposed to feed my people? How am I supposed to feed my family?" And they said, "Well, you have to wait till it's the right season to hunt." And he didn't understand that. And he kind of held this leadership position all the way up until World War I. And at that point, the Americans were seeking bodies, fodder for this global conflict. And they came to our people, and they wanted to recruit our young men. And he said no. He didn't want to let them in. And he said, "Why should we support you, and all you've done is taken from us?" And yet the promises of the recruiters were overwhelming and overpowering, and the young men wanted to hear what the recruiters said. They wanted to fight. They wanted to leave. And so he said, "Okay, well, if you're not going to listen to what I have to say, then how can I be your leader?" And he stepped down and he abdicated, because he knew he was no longer an effective leader. He couldn't be an effective leader if he didn't have the support of his people. And so from that time on, my family has kind of been in and out of the fringes of our communities. And, over time, it came down to a number of children and my direct grandmother, Evelyn Evans. And my grandmother was one of the generation of Native people in the West who were taken from her family and put into residential schools. And she was put into the Stewart Indian School in Carson City, Nevada. And while she was there, they were very mistreated. And the stories that we've heard of what took place in her lifetime are terrible. They're horrible. And she says children disappeared in the night. She didn't know what they were doing with them. There's some evidence that there were testing being done on them, chemical testing, to see during wartime what would the effects of chemical warfare would happen to these children. And there was mass graves outside of the school, and she tried to escape many times. As far as we know, she tried to escape 3 times and was successful the last time. And with the help of her cousin, she escaped and ran from the boarding school all the way till she got to Montana, where they hooked up with a group of migrant laborers who were, picking fruits and vegetables. And so she stayed there and met a man who was in the labor camp, and then began to have children. My father, in particular, a set of twins, and in the end, she had 10 children, all my aunts and uncles, and never really returned to her homeland. She was so frightened of the place that they would catch her, put her in jail for escaping, and so they hid out in a small town called Delano, California, and started to raise their family there. My grandfather, whose name is Geronimo Galvin, was an entrepreneur. He started a little saloon and a restaurant, and was a fairly successful businessman in this very small rural California community, which had mostly there were Mexican families and non-Mexican families, white folks, very few Native people. And my dad tells me a story that when they moved there finally, and he was a young boy, that they purchased a little house in the urban center of Delano, which is like a crossroads. And a brown lady knocked on the door, and when my grandmother opened the door, she spit on her and called her an Indios and told her to go home. Who's the immigrant? Excuse me. So, turns out that my grandparents died young, and 10 children were left parentless. My grandfather died in a car accident, and my grandmother developed some form of cancer, possibly from the pesticides they used in the agricultural industry. And it left 10 children without parents and nowhere to go, and they decided to move them, split them apart. So there were 3 boys and 7 girls, and they went to different families. And there was a family of this woman and man took in my father and his brothers, and they were originally from Oklahoma, the James family. And so they moved them out into Oklahoma, and rural Oklahoma, and split them apart from the sisters, who all remained in California. And at that time, my father was a young man and only spent a couple of years with the James family, but entered the service. The James family did a lot for my uncles and my father. They supported them. Their church supported them. They supported their education. They put them into private schools. And my father gained a great appreciation for education as a young man, and the benefit, he could see the benefit of this generosity from this family, the Jameses. And eventually went into the service and in the Army and was released miraculously just before they were sending his units to Vietnam. My other uncles weren't quite so lucky. But he then went back to California and began work as electrician. He did all kinds of jobs. And he met this rebellious Italian girl in California who had left Rochester to visit her sister, who was now living in Southern California. And they struck up a relationship and fell in love. And then it was me. And I appeared, and they realized that they probably were needing to settle down a little bit more firmly and to get themselves on track and be serious about life. And so they moved back to Rochester. I think I moved here before I was 3, I think, probably. And we lived over on Ashwood Drive, over in the city. So I guess what I'm saying, in my life, we moved here, we moved back to Nevada at a time, and then most recently back in the 1980s, and I've been here ever since. I'm not an urban Indian. I'm a suburban Indian. When I was a kid, I lived in the city. It was very small. I attended the World of Inquiry School, which is still operating. I learned to read there. I learned a love of inquiry there. And from my mother, I learned to be proud of who I was, She taught me so much about being Native. It's really hard to explain, She started a Title IX Indian education program, which is a federal Indian education program. You have an Indian population in your school district, you can apply for funding, and you can create this program. And so wherever we went, wherever we lived, whether it was Rochester or Reno or back to Rochester, that's how we more or less survived. Like hooking back up with Native people, getting back with each other, with our community, and that's how you support yourselves. You kind of keep yourself buoyed, And so that's really what drew me to this book so powerfully, is the profiles that you read in the story are just so real to me. It's not fiction. It's not fiction. He, as an author, has painted a picture of these individuals which is just incredibly vivid and real and sad, overwhelmingly sad, and puts them all into a place where what should be the safest, most comforting place for Native people at a powwow, a gathering of Native people to celebrate dance and music and joy and life, And yet, it's stained by this incident, by this crime that takes place, that all the people play a role in. They all are part of that story coming together. So I think it's an important book to read, because again, our stories aren't well told. We're not widely represented in American literature, although we should be. And I just wanted to say a few things, and I wanted to read a few things before we get to some questions. Tommy Orange, he's a bright guy, I could tell. I know he's well thought out, and he thinks about the same kind of things that I did and I do when I was, over my lifetime. So one of the things that I want to let you in on in this book, we kind of get a sense of it, is Native people's own senses of ourselves. Like, we struggle with identity just as much as anybody, I think. And I just want to read this to you and let you in on a subject that's pretty important to me. And this is a small piece that he writes, Blood. He talks about blood. He says, blood is messy when it comes out. Inside it runs clean and looks blue in tubes that line our bodies. that split and branch like Earth's river systems. Blood is 90% water, and like water it must move. Blood must flow, never stray or split or clot or divide, lose any essential amount of it itself while it distributes evenly through our bodies. But blood is messy when it comes out. It dries, divides, and cracks in the air. Native blood quantum was introduced in 1705 at the Virginia colony. If you were at least half native, you didn't have the same rights as white people. Blood quantum and tribal membership qualifications have since been turned over to individual tribes to decide. And a lot of what he tells in the story relates to this idea of identity. Who's Indian? Who's not? If I'm Indian, what does that mean? If my parent is Indian, does that mean I'm Indian? What if they don't tell me anything about my culture? Am I still Indian? What if I'm an adopted person who has no concept of my lineage? Am I still Indian? What am I? And so much of Native identity relates to this idea of culture, how we're brought up, what is the stories that we tell, right? But we also have this lineal link, this descendancy piece that's so critical to who we are. When I tell you who I am, I have to start with this man, Captain John. That's part of my story, And yet there's some people in this story who are Indians, and yet they don't know even what tribe they come from, And so, he's talking about all those ways in which a person is Indian, and all the things that we have suffered in our families, and yet there is this there is the hints at what could be joy and beauty and community. So I don't know if I was getting the wave for the time or not. I wasn't? Okay, good. All right. I want to tell you this other funny story that I really related to in his book here. There's a young character in it, a brother, one of three, that's being raised by their great aunt, who they call their grandmother. And the young boy named Orville has this experience. He says, Orville knew he wanted to dance the first time he saw a dancer on TV. He was 12. It was November, so it was easy to find Indians on TV. And, that's something that the fall is my favorite season of the year, and yet it's incredibly burdensome and taxing on Native people, And it's something that maybe you don't know about. But we go through this Columbus Day period, and, we're reminded of our own historic tragedy, And then we slide right into Thanksgiving with pilgrims and American fictive ideas of peace and Thanksgiving and Indians and turkeys and all that stuff. And then with, in the middle we get Halloween, which is yet another moment in Native people's lives where we just dread seeing Indian costumes and whooping it up and, all these indignities that we kind of suffer on a small level. It's a really tough time for Native people. If you didn't know that or not, it is. It really is. And not to say that we're weakened by it in any way, but it's a lot to deal with as Native folks. And so when he writes that it was November, so it was easy to find Indians on TV, is so it like hit me right in my soul, But it also is the cool part of the simple line, and it just means so much to me, is that, sometimes that's how we interact with our own culture. Just like everybody else. We see images on television. When I was a kid, my father is unbelievably a huge John Wayne fan. And he loved watching all these John Wayne cowboy movies. And I was a kid, I was a reader. I read all kinds of stuff, political books when I was young. And I knew my history very early on in a sort of in a broad sense. And it drove me crazy that he loved watching those shows, you know. And yet it doesn't, I mean, like, now I think about it a little bit, and, you know, it's like, it wasn't the Indians that he was rooting against, and it wasn't the cowboys. It was, you know, it was a sense of justice, you know, and righteousness. It just so happened that the guy who was supposedly bringing the righteousness was not my hero, you know. And you know, I always say, like, people talk to me about media. I've worked in film and television, and they say, like, they want to hear the funny stories of, you know, the Indian who wanted to play the cowboy when we played Cowboys and Indians, and I never did. I always wanted to be the Indian, you know. That was who I rooted for all the time. So this guy, Orville, you know, when he learns about being Indian, he sees Indians on TV dancing, is so real. We have a close friend, I won't say his name, but that learned how to grass dance by watching YouTube videos, you know, and he watched him for about a week, put together an outfit, and he was going to go dance that at a powwow. And I thought, man, only this one guy, he's the only one I ever know who could pull this off. And he did. He placed. He's a good dancer, really good dancer. But we're just as modern as everybody else, and sometimes we have to find out about ourselves through the television, through a book, through a movie, you know. So that's why I'm so happy that this writer is getting these stories out there, and I'm just so happy that you chose the book to read. I hope you do read it. I'd like to hear more about what you think. So, thank you.